Yeah, I've got a clock there behind me. Okay, well, this is our very last session. Thank you all for coming. Those of you who've been here for some of you have been here almost every session. Okay, that's good. So this is our very last one. Of course, I assume we'll do the same series next semester. For those of you who are doing the certificate, you should have gotten an email about micro-teaching sessions and the due dates for your assignments, those of you who are doing the certificate. So you need to email me those assignments. Even if I saw them during the small group workshop, I still need the electronic copies so I can check you off, check off that you did those things, because I can't remember everybody's CV that I saw during the mid-semester small group workshop. So, welcome. Okay. This man's not afraid of me. Usually when I teach undergraduates, there's usually like at least 2 or 3 tables of space between me and the students. Okay, so he's brave. Okay. Our last session, we're talking about sources, and there's some things that are not in your handout. I guess I should revise the handout sometime, but I thought of some other things recently that I should add, which I'll add later, but they're not in the handout today. Well, we'll start off with things not to do in using sources. Do you know these people? Some of them? Okay. You may not know this guy, Cyril Burt. He was a famous scholar in educational psychology, mid-20th century in America. And he had a distinguished career. He started out honest and ethical. He did some really good research on things like intelligence and achievement in education. And then for some reason, it's not really clear why he started cheating. Even though he was already successful and he had done good research, he started cheating. He started fabricating data, making up data, and then publishing studies with fabricating data. It makes no sense because he was already successful as an academic. He had already done good work. And why he started doing that, I don't know. But it was found out that he was fabricating data, and maybe back then the consequences were not as severe, but today he would have gotten fired immediately. His career did suffer as a result. I don't think he got fired, but his career suffered. You all know about Dr. Huang, Dr. Frankenstein, of course. What's he doing now after his scandal? He's working for, I think, a private research institute. And I met a Code professor, and of course, private research institutes, they try to apply for government grants. I met a Code professor who sits on the board of the government granting agency that decides whom to give government grant money to. And he told me they got a grant application from him, and they didn't want to give him grant money because he's a crook. He's a crazy guy. Xin Zhang, most of you know her. Okay, do you know Xin Zhang? It was a famous scandal of 2005, yeah, something like that. A woman who is an art historian claimed to have a PhD in art history and all that. Turned out she had no PhD at all. It was all made up. So most of you know about her. The funny thing is, around the time I was in grad school working in a research lab, my lab mate and classmate in psycholinguistics, educational psychology, had the same name, Xin Zhang. And she was worried about not being able to get a job back in Korea because she happened to have the same name. She happens to look sort of like her too, kind of a small petite woman, similar features. She was able to become a Kangsa at Seoul Daehak, and now she's a professor at Kwanghyundae. So the one that I know did okay. She, I guess, I don't know what she's doing. Around the time of these two, kind of in between, or maybe before her, there was a big story in Europe of Hinder. Do you know about Schön? This was actually a big scandal in the science community. On the same level as Dr. Huang, kind of the same level, although it was more of a big thing in Europe. He was a physicist. He had gotten his PhD from University of Konstanz in Switzerland, and he was working in Europe as a research physicist, and he was publishing a lot of papers. He was very productive. He was publishing like every 3 weeks in major science journals. And when you publish that often, it kind of raises a red flag, it raises suspicions. And people looked at his writings and they saw similarities, and they investigated and found he was fabricating data and he was recycling data, both. So fabricating is you just make up data, and he even did that during his PhD research. And then he was also recycling data. Even if he did have proper data, he was recycling it. So recycling means you publish something in one journal article, and then you publish basically research from the same data in another journal and pretend that it's new data. That's recycling, or self-plagiarism. Now, it is possible to do something like that ethically. I could, and I've done it. So you could present maybe preliminary findings of your research at a conference, and it gets published in a conference paper. Then you do a full analysis, and then you publish it in a proper journal. But you're going to acknowledge this is a reanalysis, maybe in a footnote or somewhere in your journal article, you would say this is a reanalysis of data I presented at this conference or this publication. You're going to acknowledge any previous use of the data. It's possible you could do a big study and you analyze part of the data for one published paper, analyze another part of the data for another published paper, and you say that this study included data that we're analyzing and publishing in a separate paper. That's possible, that's okay, as long as you're acknowledging that. But in this case, it's just using the same data in one location and using the same data, maybe kind of reorganizing it and pretending, publishing it as if it were a different or new study without acknowledging the previous publication. That's recycling, that's self-plagiarism. And that's an ethical violation. So because of that, 21 of his science articles were retracted. That is, the science journals said, we are unpublishing this article. We're retracting it. So it's no longer a publication. And because he had fabricated data for his PhD was revoked. So if they find that somebody fabricated data during their, for their PhD research, they can actually take away somebody's PhD. It's happened in Europe, it's happened in America. I know of a case, I was a college student at Purdue University, and I heard about an engineering student who had done this. He was an engineering student who fabricated data for his PhD research in engineering. Published it in a journal. European researchers tried to replicate it. They couldn't. After several times, they contacted the department at Purdue. They couldn't replicate it. And finally, they got him to admit he faked it. He fabricated it. They took away his PhD. Yes?
Yes. Well, what about writing the same paper in different languages? That's also
a trick I've heard about. In Korea, but also other countries. I've heard about it in Turkey from Turkish students. Huh?
I know one German guy who was published his paper, who published already in a German journal.
Mm-hmm.
He sent to Korea and published again in Korean. Of course, he made it short. But I asked him whether it is okay, and he said he doesn't have any problem with this.
No, that's another sort of recycling or self-plagiarism. Unless you specifically say at the beginning, this is a translation of previously published research, you have to acknowledge it. Otherwise, it's just pretending this is anytime you submit a paper to a journal, the implied agreement or assumption is between you and the reader is that this is new research. I've never published this before. Unless I say that this was published in a different format, in a different language, or preliminary version of this at a conference or a conference paper. But otherwise, that's self-plagiarism or recycling. And it's not okay. But I've heard of it being commonly done in Korea, in Turkey, and other countries too, where maybe people outside the country may not realize that. But if you end up applying for a job somewhere else, they could find out and you can get into trouble. Okay, so don't do that either. A couple of other famous scandals, there are plenty more. Oh, I should have, I should have there's only one American example. There's another American example. There was a famous New York Times journalist named Jason Blair. I don't have him here. I should. Jason Blair also got caught plagiarizing, but most of all fabricating data for stories. He was a journalist and he was fabricating interviews that he never really did, things like that. He got found out and fired. He was a very talented journalist, and it doesn't make sense why he did that. I mean, he was smart. And around that time, was a few years ago, I don't know if any of you know these European examples. Karl Theodor zu Guttenberg, he was a member of German parliament and the German cabinet. He was a rising star in German politics, and he was the defense minister. And it was revealed that during his PhD dissertation he had committed significant plagiarism, and so he had to resign, and his PhD was revoked. The university took away his PhD, and his political career is over. He could have been a great German politician. One of the politicians criticizing him a lot was that woman on the very end, Annette Schiavon. She was also a German, she was the German education minister and member of parliament. She was criticizing him for his plagiarism until it was found out that she had done the same thing in her dissertation. They took away her PhD and her career is over. She resigned. And then also Diederik Stapel, who was a Dutch psychology researcher. It was found that he was fabricating data. And his career is over. And there are many other examples of people who have committed either self-plagiarism, that is recycling under unethical means, or plagiarism or fabricating data. And that's a sure way to end your career. What happens if you're, even before your PhD, what happens if you get caught plagiarizing in a paper, let's say in graduate school? What should happen? In the graduate school.
It can be dismissed.
You could be dismissed, that is expelled, kicked out of school. You could be suspended. They could say, okay, we're suspending you for a year, you can come back next year. You could get an F for the course, or at least an F for the paper, told to redo it, depending on how significant it is. Let's say you get suspended, expelled, whatever. That's going to be permanently noted on your transcripts. And of course you have to use your transcripts to apply for academic jobs or for other PhD programs. And if anyone sees that on your transcripts, they're not going to accept you. They won't hire you for an academic job, a research job, or accept you into a PhD program. You can get a job working maybe in a investment bank or Wall Street where they don't care about that sort of thing, or be a politician. But otherwise, it's a way to end your academic career. How do professors catch plagiarism? Or nowadays, how can you catch plagiarism? Google it. Yes, Google it. Well, that's what I do if I'm grading papers. As a professor, how can you tell or suspect that a part of a paper might be plagiarized?
When you are reading, the flow is different actually.
Yes, the flow.
Different writing style.
Different writing style, yes. So there's a noticeable change either from one paper to another or within the same paper. And it's pretty easy once you're used to grading papers. Suddenly there's a paragraph that's in perfect English. It shifts from Konglish to perfect English and fancy words and such. It's so obvious. I don't know why students do it. And I've caught students doing this. I caught one just this semester in my writing class. I gave her an F. When I taught at the Hanyang TESOL program, I caught a student who violently protested that she was not plagiarizing, but I found the website websites and said, here are the websites, here are the links. It's obvious you plagiarized. There's no way you could have written this. And I didn't say this, but her English is really poor, so there's no way she could have written that. And so I see a sentence, you know, or a paragraph that suddenly is in really good English, different style. I plug it into Google. I put quotation marks around it. So in Google, if you put quotation marks around a phrase, Google searches for that exact phrase. And so doing that, I can find the source, the internet source, where the student copied it from. And the student I caught earlier this semester, I found that she copied, well, one student copied from, I think, 2 different sources and just kind of pasted them together in one paper. The first page was completely plagiarized, the second page was her own. Another student did something kind of similar this semester, which is shocking. But it's an easy way to get an F in my class, which is pretty generous. In America, you might get an F for the, not just the paper, but the whole course, if it's a major paper. I don't know, do you know of any other famous examples of plagiarism or cheating in academia? And maybe it's not an ethical problem, but sometimes researchers are too quick to announce the results without enough, you know, replication or enough careful experimentation. Maybe you were pretty young when this news broke. There were a physicist back in the 1980s who claimed to have discovered cold fusion, like cold water fusion, and it turned out not to be true. It wasn't an ethical problem. In itself, they weren't faking anything, but they were too quick to announce results before they had really done enough careful experimentation, because it was later found out to be wrong, completely wrong. But the problem is, if there's cool results, news media will pick it up quickly. And the problem is, news media people don't know how to report science news. I don't know if you've noticed this, but the news media are really bad about reporting science and health news, and it really annoys me, because I was trained in statistics, I know quantitative research, I know how it works. And a lot of these medical studies you hear about in the news, it may be a small sample study of 30 patients and such, and they suddenly says, based on this study, X causes cancer, or X is good for you, or X is bad for you. But that's not how science works. In science, especially health, or it's kind of the same in my field too. You have to do replication. You have to do maybe several studies, look at different environments, conditions, other possible factors. Maybe, and especially in medicine, if it's something important, do a large-scale study and really, really prove whether this is true before you start telling the public X is good for you, or X is bad for you, or X is true. So the news media are partly to blame, and they drive, they can easily feed people's greed for fame and recognition, like, you know, Dr. Huang, Dr. Frankenstein, who is probably encouraged by all of the cool, the reporting, the attention, the news media attention kind of feeds it.
There was one particular incident by Professor Robinson of Victoria, Monash University of Australia.
Oh.
He published work, part of his work actually plagiarized parts of his text 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And he was the vice chancellor actually of the university until had to step down. Okay,
I haven't heard of that. So
that was in 2002, quite
okay. Yeah, there's no there are no
He plagiarized his own text.
Yeah, self-plagiarism, recycling. I've seen it here. One problem is that in Korea, for hiring professors or rehiring, renewing your contract, there's this quota. They really pressure you to publish the quantity of papers, and unfortunately, this leads some professors to plagiarize. And I was doing proofreading for a professor at Hanyang a few years ago, and I saw, at least in his conference papers, he was recycling conference materials because it led to conference papers that were published as conference proceedings, minor publications, but he was still recycling. He changed the organization, but it was basically the same content. And it's partly because of the this quota system here that kind of encourages that kind of thing. However, it's increasingly easier to detect plagiarism because increasingly not only our published articles are online, but also your master's theses, your doctoral dissertations get uploaded. They get scanned and uploaded on the internet on archiving sites, microfilm sites and such. What used to be microfilm, they now just archive it electronically. So increasingly it would be easier to access someone's master's, PhD thesis and see if they plagiarized, if you want to expose somebody. I don't like that guy. I'm going to look at his dissertation. Maybe he plagiarized and I can expose him. It's possible. There's some other less serious problems with source use. And some of these are maybe not deliberate ethical problems. It's more like bad writing. And these are problems that are typical of new writers. And these are not so much ethical problems, but they're more like writing problems. And this could be true of new writers, maybe inexperienced undergraduate, new graduate student writers. Even those who are native speakers of English might make some of these mistakes. So there's this type of fishing called trawling, where you just send out a big net and you scoop up stuff along the bottom of the ocean floor. You bring up the net into your boat and you go through and pick up, okay, that looks good, I'll keep that. No, I don't like that, throw that out, keep that, throw that in the boat. And we use this to describe something else that happens in using sources. And I see this a lot with undergraduates. Let's say you've got a 10-page paper to write. And what do? You go to Google, do a Google search, and you do sort of this data mining or trawling stuff. You get some information through Google and you just dump it in your paper. And so your paper looks like a patchwork. It looks like a bunch of stuff has been dumped into it. Maybe you try to paraphrase it, but still it reads like an information dump, like that. You get this information dump. And so the other problem is not properly paraphrasing, not only paraphrasing, but also then integrating the information into your own paper. Because anytime you're writing a paper, you're making a point. It's either your analysis or your argumentation. Maybe it's a scientific analysis, or maybe you're arguing for your theory, arguing for your interpretation of a piece of literature, whatever. It's your ideas that the paper is about. Even though it's in third-person voice, it's still your ideas. So you're trying to convince the readers of your ideas. You're trying to convince them that my experiment is a cool experiment. You're trying to convince them that my experiment proves something, or that my theory is good, or my analysis of this poem is a good analysis, just as good or better than what some other people have done, or my analysis is a good application of this theory to something new. You're trying to convince people of that. So academic writing is persuasive in some way. But then you just go to Google or Naver and you get these some bits of information and you dump them into paper. And so there's no flow. It just jumps from information to information. Sometimes students dump in too much information about previous studies. And they don't really leave out the unimportant stuff. Maybe they don't leave out all of their assumptions and details about how they set up the experiment, and they have too much detail. And at the end of the paragraph, the reader goes, what was the point of this? It's just an information dump. It doesn't really clearly support the writer's idea, the idea of the paragraph. It's just a dump of information, and there's no connection. It doesn't make sense because the writer has not summarized enough and then integrated that into his or her own line of thought. And that has to do with paraphrasing also. And so you end up with a paper with a lot of citations, a lot of papers cited. It's kind of citation bling. So bling or bling bling in slang, do you know this slang term? Hip-hop singers wear this heavy jewelry, heavy gold jewelry. So in slang, hip-hop slang, it's called bling or bling bling. And so you could have a paper where you've basically done this data dump, and you've got all this information, all these sources cited in your paper, but you haven't used them intelligently. You're just dumping a lot of source citations into your paper, so it's like citation bling. You're showing off how many papers you've cited, which might look good, but you haven't used them intelligently. and it's just a dump of information that doesn't make overall sense in the overall scheme of the paper, and it's just dumping sources like to show off. Look at how many sources I have. Look at how many APA citations I have. And it doesn't communicate your analysis or your theory or your results. It's just a dump of information that don't really make sense. So these are common problems. Other things, of course, are distinguishing good versus mediocre sources. One of the first things I do when I teach undergraduate students is don't use Wikipedia. They think that's a good source. It's a good source if you're a high school student, but not for serious academic writing. It's good for your own background information, maybe, but not for an academic paper. And even Google, if you just use regular Google or Naver searches, you'll get a lot of junk that's not proper academic stuff. So, how do you limit your search to proper academic sources? Do you know about Google Scholar? Okay, hopefully most of you do. Now, I'm using Firefox, and I assume this is true for other browsers, but let me go to Google Scholar. This is Google Scholar. Now, at least in Firefox, this might be true of other browsers. When you're using Google Scholar, it tries to find the actual article online for you. And if it recognizes, if Google recognizes that you are on a university network, it will try to find a link to it in your university library. So this is automatically detected. There's a possible link at the Code library right here. And you can go to that. And so it does some of the work for you. I don't know if this is true in Internet Explorer because I don't use Explorer, because Explorer sucks. But it finds the link from the Code library for you. So that's a cool thing for Google Scholar. If you need to find sources that are written in Korean, of course, ris.co.kr, some of you know RIS. If you're looking for sources that are written in Korean, domestic sources, for international source, so it's kind of like the Google Scholar in Korean. Some other cool things you can do with Google Scholar. Oh, lots of cool things. You can download the citation and save it to your citation manager, like EndNote, if you use EndNote. I'll talk about that a bit more. Hold on, let me see here. Actually, I use something else, which maybe I'll talk about. Something else. I assume many of you are going to go into an academic career. And one thing you do is once you start publishing, you want other people to cite your papers too eventually. You want your papers to get out there. You want people to see your research. Either one for possible networking, and you might apply for a job somewhere and they go, hey, I read your paper, I liked it, you know. But just the fact that if your paper gets cited, that's good for you eventually in the long run. And you go to a conference and someone says, oh, I liked your paper, I cited your paper. Oh, I saw your paper cited in a paper I read recently. And so there are several ways, of course, you can use, especially when international publishers often make their content exclusive, like you have to be on a university library network in order to download it. So whenever I publish something, I make it available on my own website. But also, and some journals don't like you when you do that. Another thing is if you have a Gmail account, you can then create a Google Scholar account. So I have, from my Gmail account, I also created a Google Scholar account. It can track some of your citations for things you cited recently. But here, this is actually, I typed in Korean ESL Connectives, ESL, English as a second language. And one of the results says, hey, this is a paper that I wrote. So let me go here. So this is my Google Scholar profile. So I can search for other papers I published, and I kind of tell Google Scholar, these are my papers. And so that when people search for a title and they find your paper, they can actually click on that link to your name that you just saw here, K. Lee, and they can find other papers that you've done and find out more about you, perhaps, and they can download your papers. So these are, some of these are actually not academic papers, some of these are some of the manuals I put on my website. I don't know how Google got these. Google Scholar mainly scans academic websites. It's got some other non-academic stuff here that I've written. It's also indexed some of my unpublished manuals, and also my master's thesis and PhD dissertation. Also helpful are if you use academic SNS services, so academic social networking services, to create a profile. People will maybe search for topic, and if your name comes up, these are the research field that you're in. That's cool. But especially if you've uploaded papers to these sites, people can also find your paper that way too. ResearchGate is a popular one. LinkedIn, you might have heard of. LinkedIn is quite popular. It's the best one. It's for academic, professional, business people. And Academia EDU. These are popular academic SNSs where you can kind of link to people, network with people online, maybe find papers from other people in your field that might be interesting to you, and then you can upload your papers and disseminate your papers too. So those are various things. So Academia EDU, ResearchGate, and at the end I'm going to talk more about citing sources and such. How am I in time? So back to summarizing and such. You might have seen this before. So usually when we summarize, paraphrase, we really just when we use other sources, we really summarize it down to maybe their key findings or their key ideas, and we leave out all the other background information and details as much as possible, unless you actually need to critique their research methods, or you need to critique their assumptions, or you need to critique their theoretical background or something. But otherwise, you keep it simple. So imagine if here, this is kind of sideways, but in the original, like this whole paragraph here gets summarized here in blue as maybe, half a sentence or one sentence. Half a sentence. It's backgrounded into a participle phrase, finding past motivation studies, a participle phrase. So I talked about backgrounding before. Paragraph 2, the green one, this whole paragraph becomes half a sentence. And if you go back and forth, like 3 and 4, each of these basically gets reduced down to a half sentence or sentence. I talked about some of these techniques a while ago. Backgrounding, for example, some things, and reducing these. So the first one gets reduced to a participle phrase. So we talked about backgrounding before, and these are ways of managing the sources that you're citing, quoting. You shrink them down to like a whole paragraph gets reduced to maybe a little phrase. If you use things like prepositional phrases, participle phrases, especially subordinate clauses, it's a way to background. Like you present somebody's ideas in a subordinate clause and then you critique it. Although blah blah blah, we however believe that. Or as an example of blah blah of so-and-so's claim that we have found such and such. So you use these kinds of transitionals and grammar structures to integrate source material into your own discussion, many times by backgrounding. For example, if you're disagreeing with some other researcher or you're comparing and contrasting, you can use contrast markers like although. So although is a subordinating conjunction. Although they report blah blah blah, we however don't agree with their research method, or we in contrast, or we have found different results, or although blah 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 is not able to replicate their results, or something like that. So you can use these conjunction subordinating structures to background someone else's idea, like in comparing two different past studies, or comparing someone's past study to your own, or somehow linking someone's past study to what you're going to do. Although past studies have not been able to find an explanation for this, this study will attempt to do so, something like that. You use these kinds of structures to background, foreground, other information in relation to your own ideas and such. So these are devices used for summarizing, for paraphrasing information from sources that you're using. So we talked about these before. Transitionals are important. So I just mentioned using like although, for example. However, whereas, in contrast. You can contrast and compare maybe two different studies or some other study compared to your own. Or someone else's research methods compared to your own. Or things like, some have claimed, and then further evidence, or for example, and in fact, and since, and these carry the flow of the summarizing and the paraphrasing of other sources, as well as critiquing them or presenting your own ideas. And so that's why I talked, I think last week, about some of these expressions. And on the website, there are handouts about transitional expressions. On the website, handouts about transitional expressions like although, since, still, thus, therefore, because. And we talked about problems, I think, last week, problems that ESL, second language writers, have with these things in English. And I've got a handout specifically on problems that Koreans have, like what we talked about last week, problems that Koreans have with overusing but, with not using variety of contrast markers, using contrast or using markers that are too informal, like besides is informal. It's better to say furthermore, addition. Moreover might sound too formal. We don't use it that much. So some of those things that we talked about before. Now, in citing sources, a common problem that I find, for example, in teaching my undergrads and even new grad students is the source citation system. When you wrote papers in high school, if you use sources and use them properly, how did you cite them in your paper? Do you remember what you did in high school? In your high school papers, how you cited sources? Is it too long ago? I remember we used a footnoting system. We used a system of footnotes, and footnotes are one for indicating sources or providing supplementary or additional information about an aside information or comments. But when you get into college, and especially grad school, it's different. You have to learn some really formal system. These systems really vary between different fields. Some fields there are multiple systems. And unfortunately, professors don't really train their grad students in these systems. This is kind of a basic thing. This is one of the first things they should tell you in grad school. In this field, we use the APA system, or in our field, in case you don't know, we're using the APS system. That stands for American Physics Society. Or did your professors ever even tell you that? They just make you figure it out on your own. Okay. If you're in a lot of education, social science fields, linguistics, sociology, education, what system do you use? APA. Probably APA. If you don't know, APA is the safe thing. Literature people, what system? What's the name of your system? Any literature people here? Okay. Other humanities people, like history and such. Ah, yeah.
Footnote, I don't know the system's name, but it's usually footnote and references. Okay.
The footnoting system might be based on MLA or Chicago style. Because generally in history they use Chicago or they use Turabian. Turabian is similar to Chicago. Chicago in turn is kind of similar to the MLA system that's used in literature. Let me see. Engineers. Are you engineering or?
I don't know the name.
You don't know the name? If it's proper engineering, mainstream engineering, it's IEEE. That's IEEE. I have cute ringtones. Physics, APS, American Physics Society. Chemistry, ACS, American Chemistry Society. Any law people? Okay. Medical people. We have one medical person. Do you know what system do you use in your field?
I'm not sure, but in the EndNote program, there's a list of styles, and I've noticed there's an NEJM style, New England Journal.
Okay.
Journal of Medicine. So that's the most prestigious journal. So I think it's safe to go with it.
Yeah, so I'm curious what exactly it looks like. It may be a style defined by that particular journal that's been accepted elsewhere. APA, that's used in social sciences, that stands for American Psychological Association, and it's used worldwide in psychology, but also linguistics, education, sociology, etc. Oh goodness, what is that? Somebody must really want me. You see here, for example, in the text, you have the author and the year in the text. The year is in parentheses, or author, year in parentheses. This is APA style. This is used in social science writing. In humanities, kind of similar. You have the author and the year within the text. Chicago, Turabian, MLA. In science writing, do you do that? Do you see the name of the author within the text? In engineering or science writing? No. Because in science, do you really care about who the author is? Not really. In science, it's a strictly objective worldview. We talked a little bit earlier in the semester about your worldview, your paradigm. Might have been a while ago. And this influences the citation style. They have different citation styles in different fields for reasons, because they prioritize information differently based on what's really important. In the science fields, instead of this is a parenthetical citation system that's common. Some kinds of parenthetical citation systems are common in humanities and social sciences, education. Science and engineering, they tend not to do anything like this. Instead of the name and author, all you see is a number. So these would be numbered. Now, it could be a superscript number or just a number in parentheses. So instead of this author and year, you just say the highly followed the model, followed a certain model, and you just see a number. 1, and then blah blah, 2, 3, 4. They would just simply number them. And then if you turn to the end of the paper, the end references, it will be in numerical order according to the order in which they are cited in the paper. So in the end references, you'd see the full information for 1. That's kind of what you see, I think, probably. Because in science, you don't care who did it. You only care about the facts. That's the scientific paradigm, the worldview. You only care about the facts, and that's reflected in the citation system. Within the text of the paper, you don't usually see the names of the researchers. Just a number that directs you to the end references, where the end references are ordered according to, like 1, 2, 3, the order that they appear in the text. And of course, in science, you use referencing software that automatically does the numbering for you. And do you use LaTeX?
I use EndNote.
EndNote, okay. EndNote will do that for you also. EndNote knows a number of different citation systems from humanities to science. I'll talk about a free alternative to EndNote in a little bit. Social sciences and humanities tend to put more weight on the author's name. So in the text, we like to see the author and maybe the year for different reasons. In science, for example, it's kind of assumed or engineering especially, most of the stuff that you cite is probably going to be within the past 5 years. Probably. Right? In social sciences, maybe a bit more, longer than that, and in humanities, even longer. And when you get to the end references, you see also this difference in the the way they do end references at the end of the paper. Oh, by the way, this is kind of what the system looks like in text for biology, and maybe other science fields. In biology, they use CBE, and also in anybody in nursing. There's something like this used in nursing also. This is a numbering system that's used in biology and health, and something like that in health sciences and engineering. Does it look like this in your field? Okay, so this is the IEEE, the IEEE. It's used commonly in engineering, like 1 and then 2 and then 3 and such. And you go to the end of the paper, then it's indexed to the items in the paper. So at the end of your paper, references. This is APA, author, year. Now, in linguistics, for example, they might not quite follow this. Different linguistics journals might have slight variations, but in psychology, education, for example, they follow the APA very strictly. So it's author, initial, the first or middle names are initialized. Now, I think they're trying to be brief and also to avoid, I don't know, mainly to be brief, but also they say sometimes to avoid, I guess, to be gender neutral. If you see the initials, you don't know if it's male or female. I think that's silly though, because you could have two J. Coles in the same field, and I know in linguistics, for example, there are two J. Coles, Jennifer Cole and some other Cole, who publish in the field of linguistics. When it comes to Asian names, this gets really messy. You could have C.J. Kim. So you don't, if you can't spell out their personal names, and it's just Kim, C.J. What's C.J. Kim? There could be dozens of C.J. Kims in academia in America, in Korea, in Europe, perhaps Canada, Australia. So I hate that about APA, and other citation systems do that too. But they don't value that. They got the title, name of the journal in italics and such. Now, this is common in social sciences because the year is somewhat important, although it's kind of common maybe in social science fields, linguistics, psychology, education. Mainly you're citing stuff in the past 20 years. And so the date has some relevance. You tend to prefer more recent stuff though. Occasionally you might cite something really old if it's a really famous or really good study. Now, in humanities, it's quite different. You got the title, you got the author here, which I don't understand, and the year is at the end. It's kind of weird. In humanities, you really don't care about the year, I guess, because in humanities you can cite anything. It could be 10 years old, it could be 100 years old, it could be 1,000 years old, it could be some dead Greek guy named Plato. Doesn't matter. So the year is really not important. But the funny thing is, MLA distinguishes oftentimes between print versions and web versions, and if it's something from the web, you have to pull the whole URL and the date you got it, but that matters to humanities people. And MLA allows you to cite a lot of other stuff which we normally wouldn't cite in other fields, because it matters in humanities. You might want to cite a movie that shows how a director interpreted this particular novel. And so you can cite movies in MLA style. So there's MLA specifies how to cite newspaper articles, movies, even Twitter feeds and Facebook posts, because humanities people might care about that. Now in other fields, we don't really do that so much. And we have, maybe this looks like yours, engineering. Boy, this looks really dry. So it's quite different. Again, dates are less important in science for a different reason, because it's assumed it's mainly the last 5 years probably, so it's usually recent. It's a different ordering of information that reflects different priorities, I guess. So you need to find out the style that's used in your field, and if you don't know, you need to find out now. You need to find out from your professor, hey, what style do we use? And some fields use multiple styles. Nursing, for example, you might use, in nursing, sometimes they use APA, often they use Vancouver. Vancouver is weird because it has a parenthetical and a numerical version, which is weird. You need to find out what style is being used. At least begin by imitating the style that you see in your papers when you write your own papers. But at some point when you get to publishing, you want to submit an article, you need to follow the style exactly. If you want to get published in a journal, they care about, do you follow the APA exactly? Some journals have their own style sheet where they specify what they want, and that might be a variation of APA. You need to find that. Korean journals, KCI journals, tend to have their own style sheet. It's maybe an adapted version of the APA or something. Linguistics journals sometimes have their own style sheet, which is an adaptation of the APA. But you need to find out. You need to look at the journal specifications, what they want for the author, what style they want you to follow. If it's a common style like APA, or if it's their own particular version, you have to follow it exactly. And you need to learn, for example, how do I cite a journal article in the system? If I'm using a book, how do I cite that? Or if it's a book with multiple authors, each author has a different article. The book is a collection of articles, what we call an edited volume, and there's an editor. You need to know how to cite that properly. And once in a while, these citation systems change. APA comes out with a new version every few years. And I think about maybe 10 years ago, APA made a slight change in how you cite articles that are from an edited volume. They changed the style, and so you have to be up to date on things like that. When you write your CV, and if you have publications, conference presentations in your CV, you have to follow the style in your field too, because you need to show the hiring committee, or if it's a postdoc, the hiring committee, or if it's a professorship, whatever, they want to see that you can follow the style. And so they expect any publications, conference presentations in your CV to follow the style in their field. So you have to know the style. By the way, here's a CBE sample from biology. And so these are some kinds of sources you might be using. And of course, by the way, master's theses are not a very good source, so that a master's thesis has not really undergone the sort of degree of supervision and quality control that at least a dissertation has. If somebody has a dissertation, that's better, although if possible, find out if they have published an article based on their dissertation in an academic journal. Try to find that first, and if not, then you can cite their dissertation. So different citation systems have different ways of citing a dissertation. Electronic sources, if you're using maybe an article that's just online, sometimes that's possible in some fields. In linguistics, you might have an online archive of linguistics papers that maybe haven't been published yet in a good linguistics journal. It might be kind of a temporary manuscript. There are ways of citing that. It might not have a date. It might not have page numbers. And you may need to look up online, how do I cite this in APA? So on my website, I think I should have links to links on these citation systems, some of the different citation systems, APA, Chicago, MLA, CBE, and such. And I've got a link down here. Now, back to Google. Usually you can save this, you can, hold on here. Whoops, what did that do? No, it's not what I wanted. It's not showing, usually on the Google Scholar links, usually down here it should have a link for you to download the citation to your citation manager. So how many of you are using EndNote? 2. Okay. How much does that cost?
It's provided by the university.
Okay, that's good. Do you find EndNote easy to use?
It's easier than LaTeX.
Yeah, it's easier than LaTeX, I'm sure. I've used LaTeX a couple of times, but only to create the documents themselves. I never learned BibTeX, the reference manager. I never used that. If you don't have EndNote, I guess you can get it from the university for free. I've never used EndNote. I use something else. There are some free versions. Now, of course, here, I guess Code makes it available for free to you, but because I don't like Microsoft, I use something called Zotero, which is totally free. And Zotero is interesting because, okay, so when in Google Scholar, if you're using Google Scholar, not regular Google, usually down here, it will give you a link to save to your citation manager, like EndNote and others, like BibTeX for LaTeX. Zotero will understand the EndNote citation format. So I choose the EndNote citation. So it should, it's not showing up here, but it should have, oh, cite. Yes, cite. There we go. So the first time it'll ask me, do I want to save it in MLA, APA, Chicago? I go to import into EndNote, and I can tell it to remember that I use EndNote. And actually, so I don't use EndNote. I use Zotero, but Zotero will understand the EndNote format. So you can download from your Google Scholar to your citation manager, whether it's EndNote, Zotero, or some other manager, some other system, BibTeX if you use BibTeX. So let me show you Zotero and why I like it. One, it's totally free. You don't have to ask your university for it. So you can go to the download. The thing is, Zotero has a standalone version, but also a plugin for Firefox. So I use the Firefox web browser. So you can download a plugin for your Firefox. So now I'm not going to do it here because this is a public computer, and I don't want my Zotero account on here because I've got a Zotero account and it's free. It's totally free, but I can install Zotero plugins for Firefox, including some extra plugins for Google Scholar in Firefox, so that here I can just download I can download the whole PDF to my Zotero, which I don't want to do usually because that takes up memory, but I can just download the reference to my Zotero, and I will have a Zotero icon, and I can go manage my Zotero database. But there's a plugin for Firefox, so I can manage my database either through a Firefox or through the standalone program version on my computer. And does EndNote sync between your different computers?
Yeah, it syncs. You have an account on web, 5 gig.
Okay.
On web, so you can synchronize from your PC. Okay. And then I've done that for 2 PCs, so you have one account and then 2 PCs. It also works with Zotero. Oh, okay. You can just move the stuff from Zotero directly.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because Zotero knows the EndNote format. It can import EndNote citations. So EndNote, I mean, Zotero gives you at least 2 gigabytes free, and that's usually enough, except for me, because I have too much stuff. But yeah, you can manage your database through Firefox or through the standalone. And so EndNote limits you to 2 computers?
I've done that for 2.
Oh, you've done it for 2, okay.
But you have a web account,
yes,
which you can always synchronize. So
yes, so Zotero also works through the web, through the cloud, through their server, and you can synchronize between different computers, between the standalone or the Firefox plugin. I use both on all of my computers. And then, of course, it has a plugin for either Microsoft Word or for LibreOffice. Now, I use LibreOffice for my as my word processor. So I haven't used Word, but for LibreOffice it will install like a toolbar, and in case, so I assume it works the same as EndNote. I'm like typing and I need to put in my reference to like Smith 2010, so I just hit the button for reference, type in Smith 2010, it gives me a menu of the different articles. Maybe with Smith I choose this one, it puts in the in-text link, the in-text reference. And then at the end of the paper, I tell it, okay, generate my end references, my end bibliography. Where is it? Like, yeah, like that. So go to the end of the paper, hit a button, it will generate this automatically. If I'm back in the main text, I add more references, it automatically updates this. So I assume EndNote works the same. Yeah. So you can use EndNote, you can use Zotero. I highly recommend using a reference manager. Now there are a few others, but the two most popular ones among academic people are EndNote and Zotero. Zotero is nice because of the Firefox browser plugin, so I can manage it from my Firefox, and it works nicely with the Google Scholar when I'm on Google Scholar. I highly recommend it because it makes it so much easier to put in references, to write papers. I don't have to go and figure, okay, how does APA do this kind of thing? What kind of punctuation do I need in my end references? You go to your Zotero or EndNote settings, and you tell it what citation system do you want to use. Do you want to use APA? Do you want to use the New England Journal of Medicine system? Do you want to use the Blue Book system in law? Do you want to use the Harvard system in law papers? Do you want to use MLA Tribune? It has a database of lots of different citation systems, including some journals have their own unique citation system. Some of the major journals do. So it knows that it will probably know that citation system. So it just does it all for you automatically. Puts in the reference in your paper, does the end references for you automatically. Then when you're ready to submit, you just, well, in Zotero, when I'm done with the paper, either while I'm in LibreOffice and I need to save it to Microsoft Word because they want Microsoft Word. I don't know why they want Microsoft Word. It's such a stupid program. But I save it in Microsoft Word and it strips out all the codes and saves it as regular text. Or you can, if you're using Word, when you're all done, you just hit a button on your Zotero or maybe EndNote toolbar. It says strip away the coding and just convert this to plain text, because he's using a lot of coding to manage your references, the in-text and the end references. It's using a lot of codes to do this. So at the end, resave it or hit a button to strip away the codes and save it as regular text without all the special codes. And that's how Zotero and citation references use. So yeah, I still need to know the basic APA style, but Zotero is doing most of this for me. And it's tracking all of my hundreds of papers I have in my database. Actually, so you can maybe see that's, oh, they have a Chrome plugin too. Okay. I didn't know that in Safari. So like you have the database here, you can manage your database. Sometimes when you download references from Google Scholar, especially for articles from less common journals, they won't be quite in the right format, and you may have to edit the citations here in Zotero, but once you edit them, they'll magically update in the paper that you're writing, which is cool. And so Zotero just automates everything for me. And you can arrange these into folders, like folders here, categories. I assume EndNote can do the same thing. Which is good for me because I have research spanning a number of different fields and subfields, from linguistics to education. I need to organize them. I did find I have a lot of stuff. I did exceed my 2 GB limit, and I had to purchase more for about, what was it, $20. But for most of you, you'll be fine with the limit. And I use LibreOffice because LibreOffice is better for managing the format until the end when I need to convert it to Microsoft Word. So if you are not a master of Googling, you should definitely master Google and your citation system. Now, are you familiar with Google search syntax, by the way? There are some little syntax tricks to learn in Google. Let's say connectives can also be called transitional, so type in OR. So it will search for connectives or transitionals. I've got a handout. I should put this on the website. Let's say, for some reason, I don't want... Hold on. So I told you I could put things in quotation marks if I want to search for a whole phrase. I'll put a minus sign because I don't want connective tissue. That's a medical term. I don't want connective tissue because I'm searching for connectors like conjunctions, like research on or, and, but, and such. So maybe I could do that. Just in case I'm getting bad results, because there might be sometimes you're getting really irrelevant results. So you can put a minus to exclude terms. So if a paper has connective tissue, I don't want that, so don't give me that result. You can use or, you can use and. Now let's say I just want PDFs, because occasionally this will give you stuff that's not in PDF format. It might give you just a link with no paper, because here on the side you see it's finding the actual papers when it's possible, but for some things it doesn't have a paper, a PDF I can download. I only want stuff where I can download a PDF. So I'll go File Type, PDF. And so it limits my search to things for which there is a PDF that it can find. So this way I can exclude other junk, like somebody's Word document. They've got maybe a draft of their paper in Word document format on their website. I don't want that. I want only published stuff, or at least stuff that's in a PDF. So I can do that. So there are these syntax tricks with quotation marks. Just like I said, I use quotation marks if I want to search for a phrase that one of my students has had in a paper and I think that they plagiarized this. So I can use quotation marks to search for an exact phrase. So if I put language acquisition together, it might find me everything on language and acquisition that I don't want. I want language acquisition, so I use quotation marks. Just give me language acquisition together, quotation marks, and it will give me that. So use quotation marks to limit your searches to particular phrases without other stuff in between. Now, Google, by the way, will ignore minor words if you put in your search bar and in little words like that. But maybe as a linguist, I really want to find something like that. Let's say, because I want, if I put in but, it will probably ignore that. Because I'm interested in but as a conjunction, how people use but in their papers. I put a plus sign in front of it. And it will give me papers that have talked about the word, that actually have the word but. Because I'm looking specifically for the word but, how people have used the word but. It's one of those minor words that Google will normally exclude, even though you type it in. It might ignore it. I'll have to put up a link. I've got actually a little guide to Google search syntax. This works for Google Scholar, also for your Gmail. By the way, if you need to search through your Gmail, like in my case, I subscribe to email lists, academic email lists, like there's one for linguistics I subscribe to. I don't have time to read it, but this piles up in my inbox. But maybe someday I want to search for, was there anything in the linguistics email, this thing I subscribe to that I get every day, which I ignore usually, in my linguistics email about connectors. Well, I'll just go to my Gmail and type in the search bar. I can type this in my search bar and see if any, that's come into anything in my inbox. Because a lot of the subscription stuff, like my linguistics mail, I filter to a separate folder automatically, so I don't usually see it. So it's good to know these search tips and tricks for Google. And then, of course, also in Gmail, you can search for particular folders. You can type in your Gmail if you want to. Let's say in my Gmail I want to type for, so I get these linguistics emails that I don't read. They're in my folder somewhere. I want to search for a language acquisition. I want to search for that as a phrase, not just language or acquisition, but together. And also in Gmail, your folders are called labels. So label linguist, that's the name of my folder they go into. So I'll type that in my Gmail. So this is a Gmail search term for the folder in my Gmail that's called linguist. Okay. So I'll put a handout on my website about Google search syntax. So basically, number one, we've talked about paraphrasing strategies somewhat before. Learn from the way people write articles in your field, how they're paraphrasing, summarizing other articles. 2, get to know the citation system in your field, find out what it is. And then you go to your EndNote or your Zotero and tell it, okay, I want this style. And then start writing and publishing. So happy publishing, and if you go the academic route in the academic career, good luck with your publishing and research. And I'm going to end a bit early because it's Friday afternoon. My voice is tired. But I hope to see some of you in the micro-teaching sessions if you're doing the micro-teaching. Otherwise, I wish you luck and hope to see you around maybe next semester or sometime. Otherwise, good luck and see you in academia someday.
Thank you.